Clap so you'll wake up the people who are taking the post-lunch nap. All right, so who knows what this talk is going to be about? I don't either. We're going to make it about whatever it is you guys want it to be about. I'm going to run through some stuff that, I want you to think about, or that might answer questions that some of you have. Who's using MongoDB? Why are they using MongoDB? Do I want to be like them? Do I want to be like somebody else? And then I'm going to try to make sure I leave a fairly long chunk of time for Q&A. So please don't be shy, because if you don't have questions, then I'm going to have to just make up some stuff that maybe you're not interested in, but I'm sure you'll have questions. So how do you get started with Mongo? If you're already using Mongo on something, how do you integrate it into the rest of your ecosphere? How do you introduce it to your organization if your organization is not forward-thinking, or if they are, laggards? Or let's just say conservative in adoption of technology that hasn't been proven over the last 20 years? I don't know. So, why is it? I kind of talked about it a little bit this morning, but just in case any of you, because it was really early, don't remember, I'll revisit a little bit some of the highlights, but this time in context of what people are actually doing about it, people who are maybe like your organizations. So there's this estimate about how much data there is. I don't know if I believe any of them. I just know they're all really, really big. And of course, the big fear that everybody has is, what information is hidden in that data that I'm not learning, that I needed to know last year or last week or last month, right? So there's an awful lot of data being generated. More important, though, is it's not how much data, but what kind of data. The data is no longer in predictable format, right? Just looking at something like social ecosphere, right? Twitter feeds. Today, you get the Twitter feed through their API. By the way, it comes in as a JSON document, makes it like a really excellent test data set. For Mongo, you can pipe it right into Mongo import. It's totally cool. But today, it's coming in with a bunch of fields. Tomorrow, there might be new fields that didn't exist today. How do you create a schema to accommodate that, right? So flexibility, you can kind of see it's become a requirement when whatever it is you're working on is interacting with many different external systems that are themselves suddenly being very flexible and not telling you up front when they're making a certain change. Agile development, we talked about that. I'm just checking if you guys are awake. We want to be flexible. Yeah, something like that. And then there's this, big clouds out there. Really, this is how I think about it. I dropped a couple of names of really big companies, right? There's, Google and Amazon and Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn. You know how they deal with the huge amount of data that they're using? They each wrote their own database, data store, custom solution, and if they started with one that wasn't custom, they hacked the heck out of it, right? We can't all write our own custom database to do exactly what we want, right? The fact that open source has kind of marched forward into the real enterprise, and it's no longer you can't use open source. If you're a serious IT shop, of course, you have to use proprietary operating system, right? When was the last time you heard somebody say that? You'd probably laugh at them if they said that now. And pretty much that's come to everything, right? Databases, the tools that we use for development. If you can't download them and try playing with them, what are they trying to hide, right? So now, why Mongo? Hopefully, some of you earlier this morning said, "Ooh, I like it. It's like JSON. It's flexible. I like the fact that you still have lots of different ways to query. You can query by different fields, and you can have flexible indexes. And I hear it's scalable. I have to learn it. I don't actually already know it. What's that going to cost me in time lost, right?" So you got to weigh, whenever considering a new technology, the benefit of using it versus staying with what you already know. And I have no illusions about it. There is an expense to learning anything new. The reason we learn it is because we feel that it will save us time in the long run. or the thing we're using is incredibly painful and a pain, and we hate it, right? Mongo does help you be agile, whatever that means, right? Because, you know, agile is a little bit like a religion. Everybody takes the pieces they like, and then they say the other pieces aren't important, right? So it means different things to different people. But I'll tell you, the reason everybody says they're agile is the same, right? They want to feel like they're a modern development organization that can react fast to changing requirements, and we'd like for it to at least somewhat be true, right? We want a system that can scale. Like, we're not all Amazon, but you know, whatever system we're building, we're kind of hoping that maybe it'll like take off, and we'll have the problem of, oh my God, we have 5 million people trying to visit our website, yay! Oh, how do we scale it to respond? Ooh, right? And we want to do it without having to borrow $1 billion from Mr. VC or whoever, right? We talked about this morning. The ability to start implementing features without having to predict exactly what the format of the data is going to be is incredibly valuable for agility during the development cycle. So that's definitely a very big benefit of a document database like Mongo, right? So Tengen, and I'll say a few words about Tengen in a little bit, had somebody, I can't remember the name of them, some third party do a survey of various companies, developers who use Mongo. Ooh, like this many of them realized huge savings in time spent on developing new features, right? Increase in developer productivity, ease of use, scalability. These are all good reasons to use Mongo. I'll actually tell you a little bit about specific customers and what they've told us were reasons for looking into Mongo, and in addition, what turned out to actually be the benefits once they did switch or once they did use it for a particular project. The thing that I think is phenomenal is whether you're a developer or an operations person, a DBA, data modeler, sysadmin, there are a lot of resources available to you to get started with Mongo, or just to see how other people are using Mongo, right? It's available to anybody to download and try it. I tried it long before I actually used it for real, or before I came to work for Tengen. Just downloaded the driver for my scripting language of choice, and then I went on about using this PyMongo in the database to store some data during a little project I was working on, and at the end I was like, wait a minute, I don't think I really learned anything about Mongo. It just worked, right? I expected it to, you know, have to tune it and do fancy things with it, but to get started, it was incredibly easy. And that's why when developers say to me, like, I'm not sure if it's going to be right, just try it, right? When you see how easy it is, it'll be a lot easier to answer the question, will it work for my project? Education.tengen.com, free online actual classes, like a 7-week course. So if you miss having homework and pop-up quizzes and exams, it's free, and it's actually really good. You can take a class and, you know, become sort of an expert in Mongo. That's awesome. There are a lot of user group meetings. I don't know if there's one around here, but given how many people raised their hand when I said how many of you like have tried MongoDB or are using it where you are now, there probably should be. So if you don't have one organized, somebody who's like one of those organizing types should definitely organize one. MMS, I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Mongo monitoring service. It's a free service that Tengen provides. Tens of thousands of users using it, so that's all people that are using it who use MongoDB, and of course there are a lot of people who don't use it. And there are these one-day conferences we call MongoDB days, where basically it's kind of like this, except all day and sometimes multiple tracks. People talk about different MongoDB operational things. Users, engineers who work on the engine talk about how certain features work, which are pretty good, and we've had apparently 10,000 people attend. And if you believe this picture, no women, which I know is not true. So they must have been in a more interesting talk at the moment that picture was taken. So, like I said, we do these case studies, right, where we talk to people who've been using MongoDB for a while, and we ask them about, how did you go about evaluating it? Why did you choose it? What would you say to somebody who's, thinking about whether they're gonna, whether they should use MongoDB or not? And there's lots of them, and I'm like, well, I'm not gonna go through like 50 use case studies and like read it. So instead, I looked at each one and I said, I'm gonna pick out a sentence or like one little bit, and I'll just, show it to you, and then you'll be like, oh, okay. That's a benefit somebody found, and maybe some of them will resonate with you. And then, if you have more specific questions about it, feel free to ask them in the second part of this. But increase developer productivity. Intuit, big company, QuickBooks, who uses it, Quicken, all those things. Turns out they actually do a lot of website hosting for like thousands and thousands of small companies, and they decided to switch to Mongo. It took 1 week for their developers to ramp up on MongoDB. 1 week. I think that's pretty impressive. I say that's easy to use. Shutterfly switched from Oracle to MongoDB. They store all of the images and user data. Shutterfly, right? The picture sharing, right? Their dev cycle is measured now in weeks instead of tens of months. That is not a typo, tens of months. That's like a year or 2. That's not very agile. Weeks, that's agile, right? Better customer experience. Well, I happen to think just getting features out to customers makes it a better customer experience, but high availability. That thing with automatic failover? I know that whoever administers the websites for my banks, they always seem to be doing maintenance whenever I want to log in and pay my bills, which may have something to do with the fact that I usually think of it like 1 in the morning on Sunday morning. But what does it matter? Why is it that every single week they need to take 6-hour downtime window, right? To me, that's a bad customer experience. The Guardian, UK, rapid rollout of new features. MTV, now their end users are not customers for this particular use case. It's essentially content providers under their brand. Became simpler to add new brands, content types to the platform. This is because of flexible schema and how easy it is to manage the whole cluster and the data. Faster time to, all of these are kind of related, right? Marketing Cloud. So this is social marketing suite. You may not be familiar with them unless you happen to be in marketing. App development decreased from months to weeks. That's faster time to market, I would say. Foursquare, who checked in when they got here? Good. Only a couple of people. It's really big in New York. Now, I suspect that Foursquare is a big customer of MongoDB because they are like 2 floors above 10gen in our headquarters building. So they probably figure, if they need something, they'll just walk 2 flights down and be like, hey, you got to implement this feature. We need it. Just kidding. They like the geo-indexing for easy querying of location-based data for obvious reasons. The thing is, it allows them to focus on actual app features, not implementing something that's core to the application, but is not a feature as far as people are concerned. Of course, you have to be able to check in. Of course, it has to know where you are relative to various places, right? Total cost of ownership that's kind of the thing that comes up. And the larger organization is the more hand-wringing there is around this. Oh my God, we have all this expertise, we're gonna have to switch, or are we gonna have to buy all new servers now? No, you can use your existing servers, really. Are we gonna have to learn all this stuff and spend so much money relearning everything? And really, honestly, Mongo is really easy to use from operational side too. We have a 2-day DBA class that I teach. I think Oracle has like a 2-week class? I think they have a 1-week class just on SQL alone. I think it's kind of amazing. One thing, and again, if you're not on the business side, you might not be thinking of, but one of the big savings on the software support side is essentially you don't pay for it until you decide to use it, right? It's not like you have to buy an expensive license and then you got to keep paying. If you buy a subscription, if you're paying for support, you're essentially paying for value, and if you're not getting any value out of it, then you stop paying. You can still use the product, by the way. You didn't hear me say that. Sales guy in the back is like having a heart attack. Disney is Any of you play any of the interactive games on Disney's site? Those are all hosted on Mongo clusters. They like the fact that they can launch a new game on a new cluster, and if it takes off and becomes super popular, they just start scaling the sharded system by just adding more shards. They gave a presentation about this at a MongoDB day a couple of years ago, and they had something like 1,400 servers. Who knows how many they have now? By the way, the other thing that saved them a lot of money is the ease of operations, right? Automatic failover, ability to add capacity and new nodes without downtime, and of course, you know what that ease of operations, reduced burden for on-call admins, you know what that really means, right? You don't want to make enemies of the guys who like physically have control over your machines. So the more they love you, the better service you get from them, and not having them to wake up in the middle of the night, that they love you a lot more for that. Forbes, easy to use and maintain, low subscription and hardware costs, right? So, if you don't care about this, I can guarantee you your boss does. So just tell them, hey, there's a lot of companies with impressive names that decrease software and support costs. By the way, that's the National Archives in the UK. They're planning on storing hundreds of terabytes this year, which is going to be like multiple petabytes. I know that says 2020, but I don't think anybody ever correctly projected how fast their data grows. It always seems to multiply faster than you expect. So the way that companies who are really successful at using Mongo do it is they tend to start with a single project. I don't think it's a good idea to say, hey, I've heard about this cool technology and all the cool kids are using it. I'm going to switch from whatever I'm using. I'm going to switch everything over to this new thing because it's really cool. And I went to this conference and everybody was like, yeah, I hear it's really cool. Don't do that. What you want to do is you want to find the project, and hopefully it's a new project. It's not one that's already running and there's not really any problem with it. But if it's a new project, you go, okay, does this seem like a project that would be good to try to implement using MongoDB? Well, it has some requirements that seem to match some features that Mongo has. I read about this use case where they're using it for a very similar type of data. And since I can tailor my schema to exactly what the application will need, it's a new application, so as I'm speccing out the application and structuring my classes, I'll figure out exactly how I want to store the data, how I want to access the data. When you finish that project, you will have gained a certain amount of expertise with it, with MongoDB, with the driver, with the language that you're using for Mongo. When you launch it and it's operational, your organization is now gaining operational experience with it. If it's successful, it continues scaling, you add more capacity. Inevitably, some machines fail. You gain experience in failover. You gain experience in how to make the redundancy work the way it's supposed to and not misconfigure stuff. That sometimes happens. You learn how to scale things when you get additional requirements. You now learn how to evolve the schema without any downtime, right? The continuous deployment cycle. It's always a lot easier than it sounds, right? Sometimes bad things happen and things crash, or somebody accidentally drops some production data. You learn how to restore data to a particular point in time, whether it's from your backups or from a delayed slave replica. As you gain this expertise, you start recognizing other new projects or existing projects that are very painful to maintain in the databases you already have. Right? Sometimes somebody says, how do I know if something is a good case for MongoDB? And I'll go, was it like incredibly painful to do with a relational database? If yes, then there's a good chance it's a good use case for MongoDB. If it was a good fit for a relational database, why would you even try rewriting it? Yeah, I know it's fun to use. MongoDB is a lot cooler and cheaper than Oracle, but if something works fine, don't try to fix it, right? The other thing is this: if you're implementing something, MongoDB, doesn't have joins or transactions, you can essentially implement joins and transactions in your application. If you find yourself doing that, please stop and ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I doing all this extra work when I could have a database, a different database, do the work for me? So just like Don't try to make a relational database do something that it was never really architected to do, like deal with flexible dynamic data, attributes that you don't know the names of up front, right? Data that you don't know exactly how it's going to evolve. Don't use MongoDB for something that it wasn't designed for, which is if you need the database to enforce constraints on data, the database to execute joins for you for whatever reason, probably not a good fit. What happens after an organization has used something like a MongoDB for several projects is their ops department becomes essentially a, hey, if you want to use Mongo, great, we'll just essentially provide it for you as a service. And we have a lot of large companies, Disney, for example, is one of them, where whatever the developers need to use, they're like, okay, do you want us to provision a relational database for you? We will. That's what their operations people do. You want us to provision MongoDB? We will. They know how to run it. They know how to support it, how to operate it. And then there's companies that do certain cost analysis and they say, okay, Mongo first. If you want to use another database, you have to justify, you have to give a business case why it is that you need another database. And it's not because they think Mongo can handle everything, it's because they realize that it's, for them inexpensive to support it, that it is general, it can cover a very large number of cases. And so, yeah, if you have a case that you need something else, they'll support it, but if you just need a general data store, they say use Mongo. I think that's cool. Now, why 10gen? Or more relevantly to some of you, who is 10gen? Who knows, who'd heard of 10gen before today? And not that, maybe half. So maybe we should change the name of our company. 10gen, the MongoDB company. That's what the tiny font says. 10gen is the company that created MongoDB. So MongoDB was not one of those community projects that just evolved out of a mass group of nerds. And I say that affectionately because I love nerds. It was designed, built, created by a couple of guys who started 10gen. And they started 10gen to develop this product. Well, I told you earlier they had some other ambitious ideas, but at the end they dropped all the other ideas and they kept working on the database. We're the ones developing MongoDB, enhancing it, adding new features to it, supporting it, and of course supporting the community, because that's how the database is going to be successful, right? As community keeps using it, gives us feedback on it, we act on it, and things go happy. So our vision, right, we want to provide the best database for today's applications, for the type of needs that today's applications have. And the areas where we're focusing, and I can tell you that early on, developer productivity was like 80% of it, right? Make it easy for developers to use, make it easy for developers to deploy. Well, guess what happens when you're successful for a few years is some companies that were small grow bigger, some big companies start adopting it, and they have very big operations departments who say, ooh, we want to be able to use it without having to learn much new. So can we just have a simple GUI where I can press a button? And we say, no, you have to learn how to use it. But also we're trying to make it easier for them. So we're still focusing on developer productivity, because without it being easy for developer to use, the rest of it doesn't matter. It's not like your data lives in Mongo, now you're stuck using Mongo for the rest of your life. That's not it. Mongo is something that services your application. And as long as it's providing a good service, you're going to keep using it as the place where your application persists its data and gets its data from. Still, it needs to be easy to support operationally. It still has to continue being very performant, fast. And as it gets bigger, we have to focus more on enterprise-type features like security. How does 10gen make a living since we give it away for free? Well, big companies always want a commercial license or some other kind of extra enterprise-y features that they're willing to pay for. We also offer support, like professional support around the clock. Consulting, somebody earlier was asking, so if we wanted to try something out, could we get like a 10gen person like me? And that is, in fact, I do consulting and training and a bunch of other stuff in addition to speaking at some only very special events. We do training. So there's free training online if you have 7 weeks to spend, but there's also in-person 2- and 3-day trainings. There are public trainings that you can take. Tend to kind of happen a lot in New York and San Francisco area, but tend to happen in other locations as well. You can also have training at your company location for your company employees or whatever. We provide a Mongo monitoring service. I told you I'd tell you a little bit about that, and I will, and it's kind of cool. Support, 24 hours, and the cool thing is, if you call in the middle of the night, you don't get a New York engineer out of bed with a pager. You get some guy in Sydney, Australia, who just woke up a few hours ago, and he's fresh, and he's handling cases for people for whom it's night, maybe in North America, but daytime there. So we have support offices in the UK, Dublin. Actually, most of the support guys in Europe are in Dublin, Sydney, Australia, East Coast, West Coast. So that pretty much follows the sun, which means that, if you have mission critical kind of operations that your company depends on, you want to make sure that if something goes wrong, somebody will be available to help you fix it at any time of day or night. And MMS, so it's this free cloud-based monitoring service. So you set up a little agent on your Mongo cluster, and this is not just for production. I actually encourage people to set this up on their development cluster, on their test cluster, so you can actually see the patterns of performance before you deploy live, right? It's a good idea, right? Like hundreds or maybe even thousands of metrics. And for big companies, of course, they're going to be using probably on-premise version of this, but this is like for smaller companies, you don't want to administer an extra cluster just to collect large amount of performance data about your Mongo database. I thought this was a legend when I first started at 10gen, but apparently this is true. We analyze the data across all of the users, looking for patterns, looking to see where we can improve the product, and apparently on a number of occasions noticed some anomalies, figured out that a customer was having a problem before they themselves noticed. And I didn't believe it, but that's why they gave me a quote to include. We actually called somebody and said, hey, your system is about to fall over, and they didn't know it. And so I thought that was kind of cool. Of course, the action to take from that is to fix the thing that would have almost made it fall over. Looks, this is just a bunch of charts. And if you want to be popular at parties, we have an Android app and an iPhone app. And then, remember those guys that had pagers when none of us had cell phones or pagers? Now, most of you are probably too young to remember that. But like, having a pager used to be this thing. Like, that meant you were like a doctor on call and you were important. Yeah, and now it means like that you're a schlub that got stuck with the alert pager duty, right? Operationally speaking. So it's not nearly such a big thing. So yeah, we have lots of customers, lots of use cases, and we could just keep going through lots of them, right? GridFS, I talked to you some about that. Dramatic improvement to this, and billions of requests on that, and reduce the amount of code, and reduce the costs, and blah, 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 and woohoo. And I'm just fast forwarding through these because I know you want to ask your own question. You want to know, but what can Mongo do for me? So, we've got 20 minutes. Go. All right, a hand in the back, a brave man.
So I'm curious about at what point would you recommend, a lot of us are doing, especially probably small apps with Mongo fits, but obviously we're not getting into the shards and the clusters and the replication yet. At what point would it be advisable to put Mongo on a separate machine apart from your application?
Interesting question. So when would you put Mongo on a separate machine from your application? Well, the very general answer to that is when they start competing for the same resource at the cost of performance to one or the other, right? So it's like any other database. You have, let's say, a Tomcat server and a Postgres database running on the same machine. They're both trying to use RAM, and there's only so much RAM, right? So you go, oh, I'm going to cap this one, and I'm going to let this one use it. At some point you go, gosh, if I could, have two machines so they're not competing for the same resource, that'd be better. It's the same thing with Mongo, right? If you're using it in the context where it's a single single server on the same machine as your application, you don't really have to worry about the high availability and failover, because if the machine that Mongo's on crashes, the app's not there anymore either, right? So nothing needs the failover, right? And scalability-wise, I mean, a single server can handle an awful lot, right? I mean, especially if you can increase the amount of RAM that it has, and if you have enough I/O bandwidth, if you have enough total IOPS to handle the amount of writing, mainly, writing plus swapping that you're doing. So there's not really a rule. I mean, no, I really can't generalize. So it's really more like a try and see, and kind of, and this is why I very strongly tell people, please stress test your application in the type of environment where it's likely to reach its limits and fall over, so that you know where that is, even if you don't expect real usage to ever reach that level. It's good to know. It's, you know, when Boeing builds a plane and the wing has to be able to bend so far, you know, without breaking, they bend it like as far as it'll go before breaks, because they want to know where that failure point is, right? That's kind of good testing. I know, a strange image, I'm flying later tonight, so shouldn't be talking about, but hey, I mean, it gives me confidence, right? That they know where the breaking point is, you know, and it's much further where it's supposed to be, right? Okay, questions, but not about planes, because I don't really know that much about how planes are built. Yes, there was, yeah.
I think you may have answered this indirectly earlier this morning, but as students who are building their skill sets, if we're interested in doing this 7 week, what kind of skills should we already have before we want to log on and attempt that?
Pretty much almost none. I would say that basic programming class,
Okay.
right? The first class that we did last year used Python as the scripting language to do the very basic. So there's a developer class, and then there's the DBA class. The DBA class is probably more command line, shell oriented. The development class, the first one was Python, then they did one with Java. I think now they're doing another one with Python. They're talking about doing one with Node or some other, I can't remember what the next one on tap is. But the thing about the class is the programming is very minimal. But if you are interested in developing using MongoDB, presumably you're already learning to develop in some language, right? So the very basic development skills, like probably, I don't know, 2 semesters of undergrad kind of computer kind of stuff. That's my guess. Although I think somebody could benefit from it even without that level of skill. It would just strange for me to imagine that they would be interested. By the way, for students, I don't know how many of you are or know of, MongoDB is like the second most sought after technical skill on all those job board type places. So whenever somebody says to me, oh, you're gonna have to go do training in this place, and they're kind of all grumpy, they're probably gonna be resistant, and I'm like, yeah, if they hate their jobs, they're gonna love acquiring a new skill that's gonna make them a lot more employable. But I usually say that's kind of a joke. I saw a couple of hands there.
I have a question about the total cost of ownership regarding the data storage, how it said internal storage and no SAN. And I guess I'm talking in particular to, I guess, the set of replicated MongoDB servers.
Yep.
Normally on a SQL server, I guess you would have shared storage and you have to have a SAN. How does the replicated storage,
Yeah.
how does that actually work as far as?
Who invented that whole shared storage thing? Was it like people who make and market shared storage? That's what I'm guessing. So the great thing about shared storage is when it doesn't fail. You know, I think that's why it's expensive. The idea behind the commodity servers with local storage, and by the way, I mean, Mongo will work with any kind of storage, right? The trade-off is costs versus speed of access, right? I mean, if you just think about local storage, RPM, the disk is only spinning so fast, you can only read so much data off of it. And even if you cache the data into RAM, you still have to read it off the disk at the beginning, although you could pre-warm your cache. But also when you write data, you have to persist it to disk. You can't just write it to RAM, otherwise it's an in-memory data store and it's not a database anymore. Local disk can be a lot cheaper, like orders of magnitude a lot cheaper. So one option is you go, okay, I have a 3-node replica set. I need 3 times as much local disk, and that's going to be like, I don't know, a quarter of the cost of equivalent SAN or something. But, you know, again, we have people who are using SAN because that's what they have left over from the old big relational database that they, you know, couldn't get enough hardware for. Of course they want to use it, and of course that's fine. It's just, you know, is that the best trade-off in terms of dollars paid per IOP? Do you guys know what I'm talking about, IOPS, right? Input, output, like operations that you can physically perform on disk. It's the laws of physics, right? You know, sometimes we'll say, oh, we virtualized our environment and now our database is a lot slower. And I go, well, yeah. But is it fast enough? Yeah, it's fast enough, but it's a lot slower. Okay, well, when that gets not to be fast enough, you're going to have to consider, is virtualizing enough of a benefit, whether it's for ease of management or something else, versus giving up a certain amount of raw performance. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Are you seeing people use hybrid environments?
Hybrid meaning hosted and...
No, relational for one part?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. While probably of the companies I threw up there, there are a handful that moved everything onto Mongo, or in some cases like Foursquare used Mongo from the beginning. That's probably an exception rather than the rule. Simply, and having spent a lot of years both in relational OLTP environments and data warehousing environments, I can tell you the right tool for the job is probably the best approach no matter what, right? Why do we have OLTP databases that are different from our OLAP databases? Well, because we found one relational schema just did not work for both short operational type of queries and writes versus the OLAP long analytical queries over large spans of data that, you know, would basically bring down the OLTP system if they ran during the, you know, the times that it was busy. So we built separate databases, and we have ETL processes that pulls data and transforms it into a different format. In the same way, Mongo is yet a different type of data store, right? And like I said, you don't want to write stuff in, you don't want to write an application to do what your relational database does for you for free, just so you can have only one database. Yes, it's cheaper to have fewer moving parts and fewer vendors to deal with and fewer different type of data stores, yeah. But that's like, if that's not the right thing for an enterprise, then it'd be silly to try to do that just to simplify operations at the cost of essentially trading off some of that ease of development, right? Is it easy to write applications in Mongo? Yes, as long as you're not writing applications that do stuff that's inherently not meant to be done with Mongo, right? If you're writing layers to enforce, you know, constraints and data types and relational joins and things, it's like, why, right? That's extra work that you're now doing that you didn't have to do before. So what are you gaining from it? You know? So yeah, I mean, I would say the majority of the places, even the ones that invest significantly into Mongo, I'm sure still have many different, you know, it's like, do you still use Redis? Sure, if you need an in-memory, right, key value store. That's, you know, Mongo can eliminate the need for that if the only reason you were using it is because the relational database just couldn't keep up. But fundamentally, it's still a different use case. So I hope that helps. Yes?
So some of the use cases, you mentioned that Forbes and the National Archives transfer over to MongoDB. Organizationally, what did those businesses have to focus on during that transition, and what were the sticking points that you guys learned?
Did everybody hear the question? For some of these large organizations, you know, what did they have to do to essentially successfully complete an evaluation cycle, to commit to something new?
And actually, once they commit, I'm more interested in once they committed, what was it, what kind of stuff did they go through
Okay.
Big deal is it?
Well, so I got to tell you up front, we don't always know. Because one of the things about making your product available through open source is sometimes people start using it, make all the decisions, adopt it, go to your conference days and learn stuff without ever actually telling you. And then, you know, when we find out about it, when they go, yeah, okay, the VP says now we have to have 7 by 24 support because we have like too big of a chunk of business relying on this. We don't want to like self-support it anymore. We go, oh, that's nice. We had no idea you guys were, you know, I mean, because I'll say 500 customers, that's 500 customers of 10gen, you know, who've committed to it enough to have support contracts and commercial licenses. There might be 500 more there that we don't know about. So I can only talk about the ones that work with us, who sometimes engage us to help them validate, right? But I would say the ones that are successful assume that they're going to have to go through training and learn, you know, all the ins and outs. Probably the most painful, the opposite of successful, are the ones that go, oh, it's so easy to develop on, we'll just switch everything over. And then we first hear about them when everything breaks because they didn't actually do any proper hardware sizing. They didn't actually ask themselves, you know, does this really fit the whole use case or just the little bit that we implemented and it seemed so easy, right? There's no magical pixie dust that makes it somehow magically work by itself. It's easy to get started on, but you still have to, you know, plan. So planning, training, I think revalidating the assumptions as they, and hopefully they do a proof of concept. For a lot of them, proof of concept becomes their implementation, which scares the daylights out of me, but you know, if it works, then great. But to me, one of the benefits of a system that allows for fast, rapid prototyping is you can try several implementations and see which one works best. Not you do the first implementation and you go, good enough, I've just saved myself a whole bunch of time. Because that might not be a time saving later on. You guys know what I mean? I mean, I have the same tendency, right? As a developer, I want to, you know, it works. Why do I need to try it a different way? Next time, I'll fix it next time. That's how the whole technical debt thing grows, right? I mean, developers and operations people both being involved in that decision is probably the most critical success factor. I was telling somebody at lunch the first time I did an admin training class, had 2 guys there. They had been, you know, MySQL admins. They said, yeah, our developers just launched a new version. They rewrote everything with Mongo and they told us we have to support it now. Went live 2 weeks ago. We're here to learn what we need to know to be able to support it. Hopefully nothing will go wrong before we become experts. And they were very realistic about it, and to me that's insane. Right? How can, I mean, that's a very dysfunctional organization where that happens. These guys should have been involved in, you know, the early phase of this. Because they might have been the ones that said, yeah, this thing is going to be very hard to support, right? I happen to know it's easy. But also it's not easy to support if you don't know how everything works. So I don't think it's any different than any other new project, right? Yeah, yes.
With regards to the Mongo shard router,
Yes, MongoS.
MongoS, have you ever seen the different replica sets run in different data centers or different geographic locations?
Yes. Well, so, you know, one of the things about, given this fast session, and I'm going to now talk about advanced stuff that some of you who have been using Mongo will hopefully find beneficial, and the rest of you can just know there's some advanced features that you might be able to use if you start using Mongo. But both replica sets and shards have a concept of, we call it data center awareness or data center tagging. So forgetting about shards for the moment, I know your question was about different shards being in different data center, but just think about a single replica set. Let's say you have 3 nodes. Or let's say you have 5 nodes, 2 of them are in one data center, 2 of them are in another data center, and the 5th one is like in your disaster recovery data center that's somewhere like far away from any place that can have a hurricane or an earthquake or something. The idea is if you lose a whole data center, you still have the majority of your replica set available, right? You lose 2, you still have 3 left. If you tag your data centers with the replicas in a particular data center with a label, you can actually tell your application via a write concern that says don't acknowledge a write as being successful until it's been replicated to at least 2 different tags, which in your case represents 2 different data centers. So not only are you having this kind of geographical, the benefit of, you can have a huge major storm on the East Coast and your West Coast data center is still up, but during the failover, you can kind of guarantee that if you only lose 1 data center, you'll still have the data available to the application. For shards, there's a concept of tag-aware balancing, or sometimes it's called tag-aware sharding, and that's the same thing, but applying it to shards. So labeling a shard, saying, okay, this shard is labeled, and it's just a string, but it could be, let's say, North America, Europe, Asia, and then telling the sharding router that you want a certain range of the keys to be preferentially balanced to a particular geographical area or tag. So if you split your data based on customer, you instead might split it based on continent, comma, customer ID, and now say, I want every customer value that starts with North America to be balanced to the shard that's labeled North America, right? So that could be for for reduced latency. So I say, well, if I'm a customer who's a North America customer, 99.999% of the time, I'm going to be accessing my data from North America, so that'll reduce the latency of getting to the shard that has my data, right? Is that kind of sort of, so the whole geographical awareness exists on, you can use it on the replica set level, but you can also use it on the shard level to either make data end up where you want it or stop it from leaving a particular geographical area. I know there could be some requirements about if you collect certain personal data, it can't leave the country or something. I don't know. I have heard of stuff like that.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. 2 more questions because we got started a few minutes late. Yes.
Is there any kind of sort of data integrity checking at all inside of MongoDB documents? Can I make a field required? Can I make sure it's a date or a string or an integer, et cetera?
So I'm going to give you 2 answers. First answer is a general answer, no. But that's not technically true. And in training, this comes up all the time where I go, there's no schema enforcement at all whatsoever at any level. Then I say, except through indexing. Because once you create an index on a field, you've now specified something that in effect can become a constraint. So one example of that is 2-dimensional geospatial indexes. Right? If an index is 2D, the field, the X, Y, longitude, latitude field, if you try to put something into it other than a number in the range that's defined for your coordinate system, it'll be an error and the document will be rejected. There is a type of index called TTL, time to live index. So you can specify for a document that they should expire after a certain amount of time. And for that, you have to have a date timestamp field. And if you try to insert a value into that field that's not a timestamp, it'll be an error. The error won't be from the schema, it'll be from the index. Right? So it's the same way that a unique index enforces uniqueness. There's a number of other indexes that can enforce certain properties, but it's not in the sense that I think you're talking about. It's not based on, in some cases it happens to be that a certain type is required, but it's not because there's a feature that says enforce that this field must be a timestamp. It's because there's an index that says I can only enforce expiration documents if this field you told me would have a timestamp has a timestamp. If there's no timestamp, if it's a string, I don't know what to do with it, right? There are object mappers. So you know how like there's object relational mappers? So there's object document mapper layers that people use sometimes that will essentially not allow data through unless it follows the schema definition of, you know, in terms of types. But depending on what language you're using, it may not be as beneficial or as important because, I mean, if you're programming in a strong typed language, let's say you're programming in Java and you're persisting your objects in documents. In Java, if you declare something to be of type date, you're not going to be able to put a string into it, right? Yeah. So a lot of developers actually kind of go the opposite, where they go, why in the world do you want this enforced on the database layer? I'm already figuring all this stuff out on the development layer, right? I've already created my, my whole class hierarchy, and I figured out what type every variable is. Why does it have to be checked again on the database layer? And it's like, well, not everybody uses a strong type language for one thing, and I can kind of understand the whole, I want to keep crap from getting into my database, pardon my French. But the only way to do that is essentially to protect the database with some sort of a service API layer, right? That doesn't pass the data through unless it's validated in some terms. But now are you actually doing the work that you'd get for free from a relational database? One more question. I don't want to run too over. I don't mind running a little over. Yes?
Question about MongoDB and the diagram you put up basically seems to indicate that's the trigger with the application, which reads an external config file, which tells your application how to shard transparent. Are you able to change that scheme later?
Yeah, you can actually give your app server a list of MongoS locations, kind of like a seed list, and if it doesn't find one in the first place, it'll fail over to the next one. So you're talking about essentially not having to reconfigure your application when you change the topology of your...
I was more worried about if you wanted to make a change in your application, and in previous configuration, you had a different sharding algorithm or methodology, so it would go look for the data in a place that was no longer there. You have to do something to your data.
Yeah, MongoS actually is a lightweight stateless process that does not know a priori anything about your data. There's a config database where MongoS gets that information from. So if you wanted to change how you sharded things, that would be a pretty major process of moving your data around. Your config database then would get updated accordingly. And
You didn't have to basically probably pull it all back out and
yeah. Let's put it this way. By the time you get to sharding, let's hope that you figure out how you want to shard, because it's kind of painful to try to change things. Because by the time you've sharded, you have a lot of data. So it's going to be really painful to restructure how a lot of that data is. So, all right, we're out of time. If you have any more questions, I'll be around this break and the next break, so find me. And thanks.